Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Very good day to you and a warm welcome to another episode of Life Matters, because every life does matter. Stay with me for the next 45 minutes or so. Within this hour, we'll unpack and navigate the complex terrain of trauma, sort of understand during these times of war and conflict, and to better understand the human resilience that emerges from these experiences. And we also strive to unpack the physiological and psychological effects that it has on the human being. To unpack with us, we have clinical psychologist online, Mahir Grant, a famous guest on the show, our online psychologist. And we're very happy that he's joined us today to discuss this topic. So, assalamu alaikum and shukran so much for joining us, Mahir.
Wa alaikum salam, Khawa. Thank you so much for having me again.
So we understand during this time of, conflict and war, we usually exposed to WhatsApp messages, and there's age restrictions on movies, there's, images on the highway that our children are sometimes exposed to. But us as individuals, because we've been getting some information of people just seeing these imagery on WhatsApp and kind of get inundated by it as well. So take us through some of the common reactions or sensations people might experience when exposed to distressing images or videos related to war and trauma.
Sure, Khawa. We're living in very interesting times where in the current day and age with technology and social media, we're having to contend and, live with experiences that we may not have had to do with, like 30 or 40 years ago even. And so, you kind of give as a bit of an introduction with regards to things such as age restrictions and how do you manage the content that you look at that's negative. And I think what this has opened up for us, not only during times of war, but we've seen even in times like COVID, for instance, overexposure to dramatic images has become a real concern that is making us as mental health professionals look at it with a possible view of understanding how that leads to ongoing trauma, both as an immediate reaction and as well as long-term consequences over time.
So, what would you say are the reactions of the human being to these stresses like graphic media content, and what are sort of the immediate physiological changes that could occur?
Okay. So let's set the scene a little bit by just understanding why overexposure to traumatic imagery might be considered trauma in the first place. Mm-hmm. Remember that trauma can be considered as any sort of like situation or thing that impacts the body or the mind with more than it can absorb and handle at any particular given time. Now, if we look at it from a mental point of view, we have to understand that our brain functions in a particular kind of way. So, for instance, just to give like a few second crash course on brain development, okay. Our brains develop from back to front. Mm-hmm. Now, what that basically means is that, our higher order, neuropsychological functions that would buffer us and protect us against traumatic imagery by giving context, by giving compassion and foresight and be able to make sense of it, that's the last to develop. And the concern is particularly with regards to people that don't have a very strong prefrontal cortex in terms of their mental abilities, or children for whom that part of the brain just hasn't developed yet, that such imagery may impact them a lot more directly, and that it's absorbed by the part of their brain that activates the threat response system. So, for many people looking at an image that's come now out of Gaza, of a horrible situation, is just looking at it. But in this respect, we say that the impact of the imagery is really in the eye of the beholder. Okay. So you and I don't have similar psychological makeups, and that is therefore what we're looking at impacts us very differently. And when it goes into that threat center of the brain, that's often where we react with either a fight, a flight, or freeze response, because that part of our brain tells us you're in immediate danger and you need to act to stay safe.
Is it true that some parts of the body besides the brain does also react, such as, your blood pressure would raise, your cortisol levels, gets affected? Take us through some of those effects.
Absolutely. I mean, everything starts with the brain with regards to perception, but just to give an idea of what happens in terms of an immediate and even an ongoing reaction in the brain, let's understand, how some of these neurochemicals work.
Okay.
So I think the most pertinent here one might be that, your cortisol levels are immediately spiked, and that is telling you that that's your body telling you you're under stress and that there is danger and that you need to get moving. And then from there, adrenaline might, also be increased. That, kind of gives you the drive to get up and go. But now, not everybody's, hormonal system, brain systems are the same. So this is not going to be, across the board reaction. Again, it depends very much on the person.
Okay.
But yes, you might react to it depending on whether you're going into a fight, a flight, or a freeze, kind of response. The hormones in your body is going to act accordingly. So, for instance, if it is your natural default reaction to go into a fight response, so people might say, okay, fight sounds a bit primitive. What does that mean? For human beings, going into a fight response, it's about control. So your body might react with adrenaline to take charge of a situation. Okay. For other people, who go into more like a flight response. So if you look at an image, you're not running anywhere. You're sitting on your couch. Flight means detachment. So there might be an understimulation of these sort of, the neurochemicals that, and as a result, you may just, you may go zone out and switch off of it. And similarly, when you go into a freeze response, your body reacts in such a way to say, I'm completely overwhelmed. I think the best thing to do is actually just to give up and to surrender to the threat that I'm going through. So physically, the manifestations of, stress is going to be different for different people depending on how your brain is processing that imagery or that sort of video or message or news that you're looking at.
So basically, you have to also gauge, what type of personality you are or the type of temperament that person is specifically. So in an individual that maybe is prone to not watch any horror movies, that would
Yes.
maybe affect them more than the other one that can maybe withstand that.
Yes, the interesting, if I may say, just on the horror movie example, is that when a distressing image is associated with pleasure and excitement, that's obviously where dopamine is released.
Okay.
And this is the concern, is that, and maybe we'll get into discussion a little bit later on.
Yeah.
But when we start talking about becoming desensitized to traumatic imagery, in effect, in a sense that it doesn't cause you to react in a way that might be deemed as socially kind of like expected or acceptable, which also leads to other problems later on.
So quickly explain the link between, exposure to these traumatic media content and symptoms like difficulty in sleeping, increased anxiety, or even heightened stress levels.
I think, obviously when, the imagery, and let's use the ongoing and the latest example of war in Gaza, it's obviously shocking, it's horror, I mean, it's incredibly impactful. So there's an immediate sort of stress reaction that tells you you're not okay. And this may affect you in the ways that you've mentioned. You might not sleep well, you might find that your appetite is irregular and dwindling or increasing. You might just have a sense of ongoing uneasiness, and you may have a definite mood change. I recall about a week ago or so, just even talking to some colleagues about the situation, we all kind of had very similar experiences of feeling like a very low mood. You feel like you have a sense of you are definitely being impacted, a very somber, kind of mood. But that also now starts to fade away, and researchers, the current thinking is kind of that traumatic imagery is not directly linked to PTSD or acute stress disorder. But as psychologists, I think what we are more concerned about is the longer lasting effects that might not be visible to the eye or so easily perceived, that we're really concerned about.
Okay. I want to touch on that long-term effects after the short break with Mahir Grant, clinical psychologist, as we navigate the physiological and psychological effects of the conflict that we are seeing, any imagery, for instance, that you might be exposed to, and how do we deal with this as individuals, has been letting us know the mood that has arisen in their homes and how they're feeling, directly sometimes affect the family. So we'll chat more after this short break with clinical psychologists. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Assalamu alaikum. A very good day to you. And remember, you can also tune in to our YouTube channel, Hilaal TV Life Matters. And you can follow all our shows as we represent you. And also don't forget to link up with us, message us, email us if you want to know more about any topic. We'll be more than welcome to navigate that for you. So please do interact with us. Tell us what you think about the show, as well as any topics you'd be interested. Today we talk about the psychological and physical effects that the conflict and the war has on you, currently happening in the Middle East. We talk about imagery, we talk about videos, and just trauma that we actually see. Does it desensitize you? Do you actually react? Can you sleep? Is it affecting you? Is it affecting the mood in the house? Please tell us how that does, how you do manage around it as well, because it would be very interesting to know from our viewers. Online, we have a clinical psychologist who is unpacking this topic as we look at discussing the physical manifestations of viewing these imagery and videos of trauma, of war rather, in Palestine, and looking at the psychological effects of it and understanding the manifestations physically and psychologically. So I think, Mahir, if we can just unpack that long-term discussion, the long-term effects on one's body when you're exposed to, sometimes even consistently exposed to these sort of imagery. But did you refer specifically to something that you're exposed to now and can affect you later? And also maybe if we can look at the long-term effects of being, exposed to it all the time.
Certainly, Khawat, is very concerning. I mean, let's understand the ongoing and the persistent exposure, which is becoming a real concern. Now, most of us, well, many of us, maybe it's better to say, don't really buy newspapers that often. We don't really tune into the 8 o'clock news that much. We consume our news directly from social media. So that might be Facebook, it might be Twitter, it might be Instagram, and so forth. Now, what's interesting to understand about this is that there's something that researchers studying the impact of social media and mental health refer to as the negativity bias. Let me say something a little bit around that. However, if you've ever had the experience, and most of us may have, where if there is an accident on the road, and even though the road is not obstructed, and we can, continue to drive, we'll slow down. We'll slow down to have a look at what's going on. But interestingly, what we won't notice while we're driving, or what we won't slow down necessarily for, is to observe the beautiful flowers that are in full bloom. Yeah. Why is that? Yeah. Right? It's because of something called the negativity bias. There's interesting research that also shows that a 10-week-old baby will, for instance, stare for longer at an angry face on a screen than the baby would, for instance, at a happy face. Oh, wow. Now, why is this relevant? Because I think when you look at the business model of social media, for instance, you have to keep on scrolling. Yeah. You have to engage, you have to like, you have to comment, because that means that you are consuming, social media. And so there are researchers that are putting forth that, these algorithms that are, for instance, being designed, to produce the images on your newsfeed is based on a negativity bias. This is concerning because it means that we have to look at imagery and consume, news and incidents that is largely negative to remain engaged. Now, when you look at it from that point of view, then it does become concerning because there is no way that cannot have a lasting impact on a person's mind. And particularly when you look at children who are also consuming media very heavily specifically social media, what it does to the developing brain. Now, in a nutshell, we can look at various areas, but as you could probably imagine, it's vast, and the effects on its own, whether it's mental, physical, will probably require separate conversations that we can delve into. But what is really concerning is something that we currently, there is not enough research to tell us convincingly how images of war, for instance, impacts us over the long term. But a phenomenon with regards to imagery that has been very well documented, and where there is a larger consensus in terms of its outcomes, is for instance, looking at the research into pornography.
Okay.
And if we look at the research into pornography, we then start to understand how looking at negative, violent imagery has a lasting impact on whoever consumes that content. And then it becomes concerning. I mean, we can for instance look at the severity of the content, because that's going to have an impact on its own, with regards to how disturbing the image is or how disturbing the video is. That can leave a lasting impression. And not just with regards to how violent it is, but the ideas associated with what you're consuming. So, for instance, if we look at physical impact on the body, now, someone who consumes, for instance, pornographic imagery or material, the physiological or the physical impact often dissipates after a little while, not very long, seconds or minutes.
Okay.
But the idea of what you were looking at with regards to your core beliefs surrounding females, for instance, that is the lasting impression that comes into play later on.
Wow.
Frequency is something to consider. I mean, I've just been referring now to the negativity bias and how it's a constant update of negative images. Whether in a situation of war, regardless on which side of the camp you're on, it's the same imagery, it's the same with a slightly different narrative, perhaps. If I'm looking at it purely as a psychologist, but the over and over consuming of it leads to a cumulative impact, that adds up over time, and which I say with regards to especially the developing mind, children and adolescents, has a major impact on their core belief system, the way that they look and understand themselves and the world at large out there. And then obviously, if there is a process of desensitization that also comes involved, it might not be immediately obvious that what we're looking at is distressing or can be considered traumatic, that might be impacting us in other ways.
So, Mahir, wow, this is, very, very important. And I don't think we realize how pertinent this sort of information is. It's not an everyday topic of discussion, because often you talk about the imagery, you talk about the material, the videos, but never the impacts of it. So I think, maybe this should have been a question earlier on, but now after you've explained all of this, why is all of this so important for us to know?
There's several. If you look at the impact and the outcome, there's perhaps a number of reasons. But what I would go to immediately is that it creates a distortion of reality. If you look at technology, and I'm not anti-technology by any means, but if we look at how it's evolving and developing, I think it's about giving us an experience, an immersive experience that is becoming more and more real. You think of virtual reality. You think of, the way that TVs and screens are made bigger and with better quality, and it's not 4K, it's 8K, and etc. That is to make it as real as possible. That is to make, imagery have a bigger impact than what real life would, for instance. That's why we find it stimulating to look at screens, for instance. But it leads to a distortion of reality, and listening to, for instance, some of the news updates that's coming from the tech side of the war is that now there's artificial intelligence. There are bots engaging you on your social media feeds. Whether that is to create a narrative, technology such as deep fakes. We know, for instance, by using facial recognition technology and voice analytics, you can create, video material of somebody doing something that they've never done before, and it looks,
Yes.
To you and me, it looks
Very real.
absolutely authentic. Exactly. So distortion of reality is one of the things that come up as a concern, and not just which way you interpret reality and the truth, but again how you respond to it. This is obviously where our bodies on a very physical level can go into longer term responses in terms of fight, fly, and freeze, just to put it very sort of rudimentary. But it makes us react to situations and facts about the world that we interpret that might not be objective, and then puts us through a situation of distress.
I want to look at some of the strategies and coping mechanisms we can look at to understand all of these conflict situations that we are exposed to in a very long way, and it's not something that we expected. We are in unprecedented times. I think the 2020s and those that are living in it was really exposed to unprecedented times like COVID, and now times of war that literally makes us feel like we are in it. But we'll talk more, and clinical psychologist Mahir Grant expounds on this topic of how to cope with it, what it all entails. And let me tell you, I'm just like dumbstruck at the information that we should actually learn more about when it does come to this war conflict that we are exposed to. But more just after this. Stay with us. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. A very good day to you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for joining us and staying with us as we unpack quite a pertinent topic. Didn't realize there's so much to understand. And yes, when you are in distress, it can possibly lead to, what you've been exposed to. If you're not sleeping, it's something that you might have seen, something that just flashed by you. And this is what we are discussing and unpacking with clinical psychologist Mahir Strong online with us. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back, Mahir. So lots and lots to think about. Wow. So thank you so much for imparting this information. And I want to look at some of the steps to follow and how we can create some coping mechanisms when it does come to managing the physical manifestations of distress confronted with such type of media material.
Absolutely, Khawa. And in this regards, for instance, I'm thinking about children because it's very hard nowadays to find a child who doesn't, at least for some part of the day, have a device, a smart device in their hands. Yes. And I was referring earlier to brain development, and our kids really rely on us to kind of be their prefrontal cortexes, to help them make good decisions, to set limits. In terms of a way that buffers them from the impact of that trauma. And there's certainly a number of things that, as parents, for instance, just to get started, we could try and do, because we want to avoid situations where our children are starting to show signs of trauma-related distress as a result of what they're seeing. On the devices with regards to the war. So I could go into some of these if you.
But before you do go into that, you've mentioned children, so this comes up for me. Is there a difference of how adults and children actually, physically react to witnessing, moments of trauma, witnessing these imagery of war and trauma, and maybe you can add to this the steps that parents can also take besides us having some sort of coping mechanisms.
Certainly. Look, I think broadly speaking, there is a difference. Again, an older person. So just to give you an idea, I speak about the prefrontal cortex and how that's so important. The consensus is that the front part of your brain, which is that all-important part that buffers you against adverse experiences and is the center of your resilience, only really matures for females around age 22 years and for males a little bit later, 24, 25 years old. So, before then, any sort of challenges that you go through, you are really still a person in development. And so the thinking would be that, to mitigate harmful effects on you, a child or a teen would need some assistance. Adults can perhaps negotiate that kind of the impact of those imagery, that kind of imagery a little bit better. But it also depends on the person and what kind of and their psychological state of mind. So, for instance, if they have been through a lot of trauma in their childhood, it might be triggering for them as well. So it's not. I don't want to make broad statements, but the thinking is that children are more vulnerable in this regard.
Okay. So let's look at some of the coping mechanisms that we can implement and sort of employ to manage some of these physical manifestations and the psychological ones as well.
Well, I'm a firm believer in what I advocate, before techniques and sort of like, skills that you can learn is reflect on your personal policy with regards to how you are consuming social media, for instance, in this regard. And I think we as adults, we need to do a little bit of a self-assessment to see, what kind of, in which ways do we consume content that might actually be harmful for us that we don't usually give a second thought during our day. With regards to parenting and safeguarding your family, perhaps one could say, don't be afraid to be the tough parent. Don't be afraid to be the parent that sets limits and says you can use social media, but at this time and under these kinds of conditions, because really what you're doing is you're setting boundaries and parameters to safeguard, your family. The big problem with trauma, at the end of the day, whether it's through imagery, whether it's through a criminal event, whether it's through war, for instance, is that it disconnects you from reality. It disconnects you from other people. Trauma makes you go inward, and sometimes it closes you off, and you can't relate as normally and as freely as you want to. So I think, the idea that we have to get our senses stimulated. So in other words, we say, go and do a real thing as a family. Take your children outside, let them smell the air, let them feel the grass, whether it's clay that you're playing with or a ball that you're kicking. Let them feel the air on their skin. Get them in, it's a way of reorientating your central nervous system to the present moment and helping you regulate by understanding that you are not under any sort of immediate danger. Because while you've been sitting and scrolling for half an hour on the phone, your central nervous system is working that as an information of threat, and that is causing a response that you might sometimes not even be aware of. So do the real thing, get out there, stimulate the senses, and engage.
Okay.
I've already alluded to boundaries, Khawa, but those are obviously important. And I would think, the way that you start and end your day is particularly important. So, again, I'll be the first one to put up my hand to say guilty as charged. But in the morning when you wake up, you grab your phone because
yes,
there's content there, and at night you might do the same thing. So we might put in boundaries to say, listen, an hour before bedtime, everybody, adults, parents included, the screens are going dark, for instance. We have to model appropriate use of using content and social media, because at the end of the day, our children are going to do what we do, not necessarily do what we say. Talking about it is another way of coping and helping to absorb the impact, not just with your children, but with your spouse, with your family, because it's been pretty impactful with regards to the war situation in particular. And speaking through what you're feeling might give you an opportunity to find a safe release for what you're holding on to, and also in that sense, give your body a bit of a break, So processing together, try and take a non-judgmental approach, when you are processing together, because you're going to sit around the dinner table with all of your family, your extended family, you're going to have different views. people are going to manage trauma differently. And from that's going to flow a core belief system that might be different. Some people believe it's okay to go to a march. Others believe you should rather focus on reading your Salah and your Quran. When the idea is that you are trying to cope with a situation that is very impactful and we are processing and sharing our feelings, let's try not to judge one another. Let's try and make some room for the fact that we have different outlooks and that's okay. I think the idea is to try and stay connected. Is the last thing that I'll mention. Try and stay connected, because through connection, I mentioned how trauma is, in essence, a condition of creating disconnection. The antidote and the solution is to foster a sense of connection, because that's where we find our sense of safety. That's where we find our sense of belonging, and that is where we can rally together and find a collective sense of resilience that will, inshallah, take us through a difficult time.
So I think, maybe in a wrap up later on, we can look at some sort of exercises and being mindful about what we are doing, some relaxation techniques, and then also some insights on the PTSD. I want to look at quickly, Mahir, before we take a break. You've mentioned that early on. So let's quickly understand if there's any connection between the physiological responses to trauma in the media and it developing into a post-traumatic stress disorder.
So, the idea from mental health professionals is the consensus has been that consuming media content, and kind of like experiencing, a traumatic situation through the media vicariously can have a mental health impact on the consumer of that information. But the current thinking that it does not lead to PTSD as such, which is more for the direct exposure, which is more through, also learning. So for instance, somebody that's in South Africa, but that has loved ones in, let's say in this instance, in Gaza, learning of their, being injured or killed, that is different. That obviously also comes through a media channel, sometimes a direct phone call, etc. But there's a direct connection. And the way that trauma is experienced is somewhat different from someone who, is not there, does not have any loved ones there, and consumes this, this content through the media. So the current thinking is that it's most likely not thought that it could lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, but rather that it can have traumatic effects on the consumer in other ways.
Okay, I want to touch on that just after the short break. Stay with us as we unpack the physiological and psychological effects that we are exposed to in the conflict of war, unprecedented times that we are in with clinical psychologist Mahir Strong. Please stay with us as we connect more on this topic just after the short break. We navigate the complex terrain of being exposed to trauma and the conflict of the current war out in the Middle East. And it's often that we sort of look at people in the state that we were, the stories that we used to listen to with regards to apartheid and, having similar situation. So something that we can relate to and understand, does it affect us? How does it affect us? I want to unpack some personal experiences while I was sitting with some media coverage, Mahir, and looking at, going through some of the stories, going through some content that I needed to prepare for a show. And I used some of the imagery and the videos, and I actually had to cut out those that were quite distressing, but I was exposed to it. And going through these imagery, we wouldn't want our viewers to be exposed to, so we needed to cut it out, edit some of the imagery, and then put on what was necessary to be aired. But that had actually had an impact on me because for the next few days, I kept seeing this flashes. I kept thinking about it. So let's talk about that sort of experience because that was also related to some of the conversations we were having with my fellow colleagues as well. You know, we were just debriefing and discussing how are we handling all of this. So let's talk about that when, you know, you can be, you know, quickly exposed to something that, you know, is work related, but not realize it could possibly, you know, affect you.
Absolutely, Hoa. You know, in this regard, you know, when we're thinking about now, in a sense, you know, we've spoken a bit about kids, but how do we as adults, how does it impact us? You know, a key word here to consider is perhaps trigger.
Mm.
You know, every person in their own sort of way has experienced trauma in their lives.
Mm.
You know, whether it was a big trauma, you know, sort of a once-off event that may have been catastrophic in nature, or whether it's those small T traumas that I've been referring to that, you know, don't often register on our trauma radars as something too catastrophic, but that it's ongoing, that is frequent, and that has a cumulative effect over time. Every person has gone through a combination of these kinds of events in their lives, and where this information is stored is deep in an emotional memory system, where it's also associated with a learning process. So, you know, that part of your brain, just to put a bit of context to it, is very black and white.
Mm.
Sees things in the context of you being either safe or in danger. So there isn't a lot of and it happens very quickly. So I could imagine, you know, while people who, journalists, for instance, people who work in the media who have to give us the news and also have to filter through it and digest it and, you know, and do it in a responsible way, could be impacted and could be triggered by what they see that might bring up, you know, situations in their own lives that may have been traumatic for them. So, you know, yes, it's what they're looking at as a specific context, as a specific focus, but the impact in what it brings out might be something of a more personal nature.
So we spoke about desensitization earlier on.
Mm.
When
Mm.
do we need to worry when the role of desensitization plays in the physical aspect a response that is not normal? When you are exposed to graphic content in the media, how can an individual recognize it, and when is it, you know, a concern, and does it need to be addressed?
Desensitization is a very concerning concept, specifically when we're talking about conflict and war, because what it does is it dehumanizes people. It kind of conveys the idea and understanding that it becomes okay to hurt other people, it becomes okay to kill other people. And the particular facet of desensitization involved in that process is that, you know, the part of our minds, the part of our humanity that needs to be activated and needs to respond with compassion, that needs to respond with empathy, and needs to respond with outrage is basically not activated. You know, we basically become numb. And, you know, we might even joke about, you know, really gruesome content that we're looking at. We might, you know, think nothing of it to watch a really shocking video over and over again, just almost as a way of that coping mechanism becoming activated, and now you're really in flight mode. Now you're really detached, and now you're thinking to yourself, I'm okay. But if you think about why this is concerning, you know, we're living in an age where the people are operating unmanned aircrafts and dropping bombs on people like it's nothing, because it's like looking at a video game, you know. And you know, just to remind ourselves that the phenomenon of video games, for instance, has been researched over you know, over a couple of decades, and people find that there is a correlation between prolonged exposure to violent gaming and more risky behaviors in, you know, in real life, which may include an element of violence as well. Why is this concerning? Because, you know, a type of reaction, an extreme form of a reaction to trauma is dissociation. You know, psychologists and mental health professionals will know that when they're working with a patient who has been exposed to extreme horrors, um, often dissociate, and what that means that is that the environment around them stops feeling real. Our patients have described, for instance, to me that it just feels like I'm currently in a video game. I know I'm not, but it feels like, the people around me, the situation around me is not real. And that is a particular problem because we often then, there is a chance that we can reenact situations that cause trauma, not only to ourselves, but to others as well. So desensitization, dehumanizing people, dehumanizing aspects of people like their culture, and what they hold dear to them is very concerning because it does make the world a more hostile place for us to live in.
So at what place and time should you realize that, listen, I actually need to take this further? It is of some concern, whether you see it in your child or in yourself.
Sometimes the way you pick it up is by some sort of comparison. Not that comparisons are always healthy things to do, but for instance, the people around me sitting at the table, are gasping, they are turning their heads away from the screen, they don't want to look at it, they become angry, and why am I so okay with it? And clearly I don't work in a trauma unit where I see blood every day. Why am I not affected by it? So usually there is a part of you that gives you that logical realization that, I'm not affected, I'm numb. And it might be something that people might be reluctant to speak about because it might be followed by immediate judgment. What's wrong with you? Are you a psychopath? Are you a sociopath? That kind of thing. But usually it's not the case. Usually it's just that, when something inside of us tells us we should be reacting to this in a negative way and we don't, that is usually the first clue that we may have become somewhat desensitized in that process.
Could you elaborate on empathetic stress? What exactly is that? I've read a little bit about it, and it's about witnessing somebody else's trauma, and then also does it relate to secondary trauma?
Yeah, so the ability to put yourself in another person's situation, in their shoes, so to speak, meaning that you're able to, without going through that situation yourself, but try and comprehend with some sense of understanding and feeling of what it's like for that human being, is what we refer to as empathy, and it is a higher order mental ability. And with regards to that prefrontal cortex, again, it's that last part of you, of your brain that has to mature, and it is very essential, obviously, for many reasons that we have empathy, so that we can, build a world that is safer, to put it in short. But yes, can it also lead to trauma? That is what your question is pertinently about. Yes, trying to fathom, trying to absorb what it's like for people who are under constant bombardment, who have no place to sleep, who have nothing to eat, no water, no medicine. Trying to understand what it's like as a parent to not know where your children are, where your little babies are. That empathic ability, does make you absorb similar kinds of feelings. Perhaps if we want to argue it, say at a somewhat reduced rate, but still enough of those kinds of negative emotions, to put us in a state of secondary trauma. So I definitely think that can happen. We've cleared up whether that leads to PTSD. Very unlikely, unless you already suffered from a form of PTSD, and this situation now triggers that relapse of that condition. But even in the absence of that, through having empathy with people and understanding the misfortunes that they go through, and being able to feel can evoke traumatic reactions in us.
So, Mahir, we have to wrap up, and we want to look at now how therapy or support system can actually help individuals who have been exposed or are sort of managing these physical and psychological manifestations when it does come to media exposure.
So again, one has to be guided by what your specific needs are at the time. I mean, if you are already finding yourself in a state of distress, and you're noticing that you are feeling somber for most part of the day, that you are feeling anxious and jumpy for most part of the day, or just more usual than you would otherwise have. If you're not sleeping well, if there are changes, significant changes in your appetite, either up or down, if your energy levels are not as good as they were a couple of weeks ago, and it's not just because it's the end of the year and you're working
Mm.
very hard, then you might want to start thinking about and taking stock of where your mental health is at the moment, and also want to remind people to obviously, as a starting place, perhaps think about reaching out to Lifeline. The South African Depression and Anxiety Group would be another example. Talk to somebody, talk to your loved ones. It's only through talking about how you feel and what you're experiencing that you would be able to make some sort of self-assessment to know
Mm.
whether you need any further assistance or not. So that would be a very important starting place, as just to do a bit of a check-in.
Okay.
Um, it has been a couple of weeks again, and then you may have gone through the process now
Mm.
in different ways already. But I think a check-in at this point is very well warranted,
Awesome.
even if it's just a self-check-in.
Yeah, and these numbers we will provide with you, provide on the screen, as well as if you contact us, we'll send you those contact details. They are toll free, and I've heard of some people that use it as well, and they're very, very helpful. Lifeline and the Depression and Anxiety Support Group. Thank you so much, Mahir. It's been an absolute pleasure. You've shed some wonderful light on this topic, and it definitely enhanced us better to understand, the physiological and psychological effects that we are living in with the world of conflict. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure chatting to you. Assalamu alaikum. Have a good day further.
My pleasure. Walaikum salam.
So there you have it, our clinical psychologist, online clinical psychologist as well, Mahir Strong, and he is available online as well. So if you need to connect, and please do find the help that you need. If you found any of these symptoms or anything that you can relate to, do contact us, and we'll try and help and send the necessary numbers and contact details out to you. Stay with us as we continue Life Matters in Parenting. Is yelling and shouting something that you're doing? See what long and short-term effects it has on your child. And we talk to various experts on these topics when it does come to parenting experts. So stay with us as we highlight how life really does matter on Life Matters. From myself, Hawa Solomon, wassalamu alaikum, and goodbye for now.